Well, welcome everyone. We're going to go ahead and get started. This is Pastor Jacob, and we are thrilled today to be able to welcome a special guest speaker to our church over Zoom. You may have heard us talk a little bit about in previous weeks, I hope you have, that our church is seeking to become something called a WISE church, which stands for Welcoming, Inclusive, Supportive, and Engaged on Mental Health. And there's a committee at the church that's trying to think of what are the most productive ways that we can not only educate other people about mental health issues, but to support people as they go through different challenges, but also to make sure that everyone who is working through mental health challenges and substance abuse and use disorders, that they are fully integrated into the life of the church and the leadership of the church, and that we're not just ministering to people, but everyone's included in our community. So a large part of that moving forward, particularly during this time, is making sure there's educational opportunities so that we can all engage these issues. And so thank you to one of our committee members, Jennifer Clancy, who has invited our speaker today, as we welcome Elizabeth Morrison, who is a licensed clinical social worker and clinician. And she specializes in sustainable integrated behavioral health. And so she actually wrote a manual on integrated behavioral health. That's one of her specialties. And she also trains healthcare professionals in communicating with empathy. And so she's here to talk to us on the topic of loss, grief, and gratitude, which of course, grief is something we're all going through right now on small and large levels, and hopefully finding ways to also cultivate gratitude. So if we could all welcome Elizabeth, I'm going to spotlight her screen, and thank you for welcoming her to our space today. Elizabeth?
Thank you so much, Jacob. Should I share my screen now?
That would be great.
Okay. Let's see. Can you see?
Yeah. We got it. We can see it.
Oh, good. I'm so glad. Hi, everybody. I'm so glad that I can see a lot of people's faces. I was chatting with my husband this morning about this and saying how much harder it is sometimes when you can't see people's faces when you're talking with them. So I'm really glad to see people hop on and see some of you have two in a frame, which is really nice as well. I just want to say again to Jacob and Jen Clancy, thank you so much for inviting me and for trusting me and bringing me into the fellowship. I have actually been to UCC, which I'm really glad about, because even though you're not actually in the building right now, I have this mental picture of UCC because I went to Jen and Peter's wedding, and Jacob met you and Jen when you officiated that wedding. And we were deeply touched by the church and the space and the service and you and Jen. So thank you. Thank you for having me. I wanted to say how impressed I am about your church's decision right now to really, one of my specialties is integrating behavioral health, which means sort of making it okay to bring our whole selves into our medical systems, essentially, when we come into an appointment, that we can also talk about, our mental health and struggles with substances and worries about our children. And it sounds like you're doing exactly that, where you want to really invite people to bring their whole selves into the church, and to not think that there are some things that shouldn't be talked about, or that we have to leave parts of ourselves outside the door when we come in. So I love that. It's deeply aligned with what I think is so important in my personal and professional life, and I love to be a part of that. I've been thinking, just since I was asked about this subject to talk about it, I've just been letting it sort of come around in my mind and think, what is it that I feel like is one of my experiences of this personally, and thinking about, professionally, doing therapy with patients for many years and trying to think about some of the things that have felt most meaningful to me in this area that I thought might be useful to talk about. And we chatted just right when I hopped on just about that I was going to stop early enough so that we could hear from people. If you'd like to share your own experiences or comments or questions, there'll definitely be time to do that. This is a picture of my mom and her boyfriend, who she calls her gentleman friend because he's 85 and she's 80 and she thinks boyfriend is not appropriate. They met about a year after my dad died, and it corresponded exactly to my husband and I buying my mom an iPhone because she got on a dating website and met John, which is we're really happy about. They're really happy. And this picture is on her birthday, which is March 21st. She turned 80 on March 21st. And they're in our house, which they haven't been since then. But this was, within sort of a week of the more severe sort of shelter in place restrictions. And the reason I have this up here is because we had an 80th birthday party planned for her on the Oregon coast, which is her favorite place. She loves the Oregon coast and always wished that she could live there or have a house there. And my siblings and I rented a house there and had planned for about a year for this 80th birthday party. And I had made this scrapbook for her that I had spent months, with this table in our living room, putting together this scrapbook kind of her life for her and different pages from people. And very nice. It sort of became clear maybe a week or so before this that we weren't going to be able to do that. And instead she came over and we, John gave her a bracelet, which he's putting on her right now. And I had given her the, sort of handed her the book, which is sitting next to her with the red ribbon on it. And she didn't open it while she was there. And, it was obviously very different from my picture of how this was going to look. And sort of envisioned her with, all of her kids around and being able to look through this book and on the beach. And I feel the loss of this, particularly because as we sort of talked about, maybe in the fall, maybe next year, it sort of became clear that there wasn't any real way to sort of convince ourselves that it might happen, but we didn't feel confident that it, may or may not happen in the future. And it is a loss. And at the same time is really hard to sort of even think about it or talk about it as a loss. And my mom was particularly unwilling to do this, sort of saying, we're lucky to just be together and we're just going to do this next year, and just this sort of difficulty of acknowledging the loss. And so I share that because I think one of the things about loss is that we do often have this internal way of ranking what's a significant enough loss. And it's typically in comparison with others, or sometimes it compares internally in ourselves. I'll say, well, I lost my dad, this many years ago, and this is nothing compared to that. And so I shouldn't acknowledge this or think about this. It ranks really low. And I think in a time right now with the pandemic, when, those of us who haven't lost people close to us, we know that others have lost people close to them. And it, in a way that just sounds terrible to us right now, that they were alone in a hospital without people around them. And we know people who have lost jobs and are in severe economic difficulty, lost the ability to visit relatives who are in nursing homes. And so I think right now it's this very particular time where this piece about sort of acknowledging loss that maybe we don't feel like ranks high enough is particularly hard, because we can see and hear all around us what seem like perhaps more significant losses. And so this is all to say that there is an importance to acknowledging loss that I'm going to kind of continue to talk about through this, that being able to sort of relate to loss, being able to grieve loss is all contingent on being able to acknowledge it. And so to sort of give ourselves permission to acknowledge losses and kind of stop the ranking process for a moment. I wanted to give one more example of loss that I was feeling, and then ask you to sort of think about losses that might not be acknowledged right now or up until now. And the one on the left is my son, and the one on the right is who he calls his best friend, Ethan. This was March 3rd, his birthday. We were at like, this sort of pizza arcade place, and they had won all of these things with that grabbing thing that they were so excited about because it wasn't rigged. That's their thing. Like, they're always rigged. And, that this one, they won every time, so they had to keep going. But he's a kid who struggles with friendships. He struggles with friendships, and it's, worries my husband and I, and that we think about a lot, and that we kind of feel pain about. This is a friend who he has had for many years, and we also sometimes worry about this relationship, but he's been able to sort of maintain some consistency with this friend and some closeness, and we kind of do whatever we can to support that, particularly because we worry about his friendships and ability to connect with other kids. And of course, right now, this kid was down visiting his, of course, my son wouldn't be able to see him now anyway. And this kid is now down in San Diego with, he was sort of stuck down there when all of this happened with another parent. And, my son doesn't have like a phone in the traditional sense or social media. He's 11. And so the ability to connect with this kid is really all but lost. And I think that that's really a loss for my son, and that I'm really feeling that too. I'm sort of carrying that around, that fear and worry and wondering what it's going to be like. And, seeing his, anger when he has to get off his screen, when he's playing with his friends, and wondering how much of that anger is around him feeling this larger loss of the connection, other connections with friends. And, so I wanted to just share those two because I feel like they are losses that took me a while to acknowledge, because I have that ranking that I just described about what might not be okay to grieve or to think about or acknowledge in myself. And I just wanted to invite those of you who are on with us right now just to think about for a moment the losses, like what you can feel. And I've sort of been writing this like running list of things that I feel like many of us are feeling right now in terms of losses. And I'll read some of them as you're thinking yourself about the losses that you might be experiencing right now. Relationships, I think couple relationships are experiencing some losses right now if you have children in the home, because now they're here all the time and we don't have babysitters or people that we can ask to watch them. And so there's some losses around couple relationships in terms of intimacy. Many of us have lost kind of a sense of safety that we might have had now that we see this new threat, this new possibility of pandemics. So there's like a sense of safety, I think, we've lost. Community connections, being out in the community, fellowshipping in person in churches. My husband and I are both in AA and are also going to AA meetings online, like you all are attending services online. And there is a loss of like a collective elevation when you're all saying a prayer together. In AA, we always say the serenity prayer together to open a meeting. And when you're hearing everybody say that, it has a different feeling for us. And we lose that now when we're sort of muted praying together. And that's true of even when we're together on Zoom, there's a lot that we lose, handshakes and touching and hugs, and our rituals, our sort of anthropological rituals like weddings and funerals, and for our kids, proms, graduations, trips, family relationships, jobs, economic safety. Even for those of us who are still working, sometimes a sense of safety that we had about predicting income and economics is gone for some of us. So, and then some of us have lost people close to us, and it may be pandemic related, and it may be having just lost people right now and then lost the ability to have what we would normally consider as our community acknowledgement of that. Seeing people's faces is a real big loss. In the grocery store, my husband and I walk to the grocery store in the morning. He stays outside while I go inside, and I'm really feeling, what it feels like to not see people's faces, because the connection is really hard. It's hard because we don't stand and connect anymore, because it's transactional now. You need to get in and out. And also it's harder to connect, obviously, when we can't mirror people's facial features and see them as people. So a lot of losses. I wanted to talk just for a few minutes about, many of these words will be familiar to you all. They came, sometimes we refer to 5 of them anyway, as like the stages of grief and loss. And this came from a very famous psychiatrist, Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and then Kessler, and there's been some famous psychologists and psychiatrists after who have sort of built on this work. And I sort of drew all over it, because I think the one piece that we know is that there aren't necessarily stages, and there certainly are not linear stages to grief and loss. And instead, there are probably common experiences or feelings that we have at different times. And we sort of, go back and forth and in and out. And there are many more than this as well. I think these are some of the more common ones. And I think when we think about the virus and the pandemic and the response and the losses associated with it, you can see really how all of these play out in this. We saw a lot of denial, and some of us may have had a lot of our own denial around the virus, and really denial around the losses around the virus. That it wasn't going to be that bad, that we would just do this next year, like sort of my mom. This isn't a real loss. We're just going to do it next year. This sort of denial that it's happening. Anger is really common, and I've seen that, I know, in my daughter, where she feels anger. My anger a lot of times is turned, politically. But there's sort of anger is a way to, in some ways, keep us from feeling the grief and loss. And we can see a lot of anger sort of out there in collective responses as well around this. Sometimes people feel angry at God. It's not uncommon at all when people are going through hardships. I'm sure many of us have had that experience when you've had grief or a deep loss, that there's almost a childlike tendency to be mad at God. The bargaining is when we sort of make deals. Sometimes we make deals with God. I will be so good if you can give me this, right? That's sort of a small child way of interacting with God that we sometimes return to during times like this. And we can see sort of bargaining out there in the world around this virus and the pandemic about, what we're willing to sort of give to get, as if we have sort of some control over the losses right now. And then, of course, sadness is probably the one that is most obvious, that the underlying feeling of loss and grief is a deep sadness. And right now, I added in guilt and anxiety. I think my years as a therapist, I think I have noticed patterns repeatedly with patients during periods of loss where there's guilt. Sometimes there's guilt that we somehow had something to do with the loss, or we could have done something different to prevent the loss. Even around economics, losing jobs, sometimes we have this deep guilt, like I could have done things differently if I had managed our money differently, if I had been different at my job. Right now in the pandemic, sometimes we have this really deep guilt, like, could I have given it to this person? Should I have been doing something different earlier to keep this from happening? And that's closely related with anxiety. Right now, grief seems very intertwined with anxiety. We're feeling grief and loss, and we're also anxious about losses and grief to come. what more are we going to lose? What's coming? What can't we predict that we're going to lose that we don't know? And then these two pieces over on the left, the meaning and acceptance. Early on, acceptance was sort of the end of this, this sort of process. And really, I think since then, there's been a lot of thinking around meaning really being really tied with acceptance. And that's really when I'm sure all of us have been through this experience where we feel that there's a sense of meaning around the grief and loss. And so I know for some of us, we might think, well, it's happened for a reason. And even if we don't know what that reason is, we deeply believe there is one. And that can give meaning to losses. Sometimes, even if we don't necessarily have that belief system, we believe that there is good that can come out of everything. And either there's good now that we can feel and relate to, this was a deep loss and I see this good, this positive that came out of it. My life, I've been changed as a result of this for the better. My life has been changed for the better. Or I've been able to sort of make some meaning of it where I feel like I have been through something now that I can share with others. I have a deeper sense of empathy for others in this and I can share it. I know I went through a divorce that was deeply painful and difficult and a lot of grief and loss associated with that. And I wasn't sure what the meaning of it is, sort of this loss of the idea that I could be someone who was married once forever and all of the life that I had imagined with this person. But then at some point I became really grateful that I had gone through it because I talked to so many people now who have gone through divorces. And I feel like I have something to offer and I feel more understanding. And so sometimes that's the meaning of it. But this is the place that I think all of us would like to be able to get to where we feel there's been some good and there is some meaning to all of this. So I wanted to talk about just a couple sort of strategies to help us get there. They're not solutions. I think one of the things about grief and loss is it is sort of what it is. And this permission to not feel like we need to move through it or be feeling differently is deeply important. These are just things that can help us as tools to sort of relate to what we're experiencing while we're in it. And one of them is this phrase that we use often in therapy, name it to tame it. And it really refers to naming feelings. That it's very hard to manage feelings, to relate to them, to get our kind of arms around them, to get perspective on them and be able to kind of interact with them in a different way, unless we know what it is, unless we can name it. So many of you have probably had that experience where you're extremely anxious and frightened and in fear. This happens to me all the time. And I'll just have this discomfort, this suffering, this feeling. And then at some point I think, oh, I'm fearful. I'm having fear about money. Oh, I'm having fear about money. I can sort of name it. And then it gives me this perspective on it where I can say, oh, I have some tools to deal with fear about money. I can ask God to remove it. I can talk to my husband about it. I wonder if there's actions I can take or if it's just, asking for it to be removed, that there's no actions I can, I have this sort of set of tools around that once I've named it and I know what it is. So very similar to loss and grief and some of those other feelings, the anger, the bargaining, the guilt, the anxiety. If we can name it, it can help us interact with it. And often one of the ways we learn this is with small children, where their feelings seem so big and unmanageable and they come to us and they're so mad and we can say to them, you seem really mad, and they'll say, yes, I'm mad. You can almost see them get their hands around what you've named for them. It's one of the ways we can help them deal with these big emotions. Well, we can do the same for ourselves to help us in the same way that we would with our children. The other thing that can be really, really helpful is rituals. So we have rituals to mark loss as a society, and individually we have rituals that we've developed. The idea that it's an act or an action that has more meaning than the action itself, that it indicates more to us. I put coffee on there just because I think I have a lot associated with coffee. I think because I'm in AA, there's this association with coffee and AA. There's always a coffee maker there. The coffee pot's always on. People get there early. You get there early. You have coffee. You talk with people. I've had coffee with my husband every morning for 18 years or something like that, and it really symbolizes more than that. It's this time to connect in the morning, before we had kids, and then before the kids are up. And so it's an act that has more meaning than the act itself. And right now, because we've lost so many of our societal rituals, the weddings, the funerals, the graduations, the fellowshipping in church, being able to develop new rituals individually in terms of our own routines that are meaningful to us, and then as a society, and then as a community, like you've done here, this kind of new ritual of gathering for Zoom meetings and Zoom fellowships can be really important for us, and just not only acknowledging the loss, but also that piece in making meaning out of what's new. And I just wanted to share a couple things that I found really inspiring around rituals recently. This is a picture from my closest friend who lives in New York City, and it was on Easter. And on Easter, the New York City Fire Department gave Easter baskets to the frontline healthcare workers. Aww, and the community all came to watch this happen. It happened on multiple streets all over New York City. And my friend had taken this picture, where you can see the frontline workers over there in the left, where they were giving them Easter baskets, because we lost our sort of normal Easter rituals. But here's this new ritual that seems so special, so special and so sweet. And I took this picture, this is a picture in our neighborhood. I'm guessing many of you have noticed a lot of chalk art in your neighborhoods, which is really a way to kind of, it looks to me like it's sort of some ritual or routine that's happening to take the place of like children playing together in the parks. Instead, children are sort of making this public art for each other out on their driveways. This is a fence on the way to the park that we walked to, and this was on Easter. So clearly someone had taken a lot of time to make this public art for others on Easter. And I took a picture and sent it to my friend who used to live in this house, and I said, look what's on your old house this morning. But I think this sort of public art ritual acknowledgement is really interesting, in that it acknowledges that we're not all together doing the things we would normally do, and that here's this new ritual that has some meaning in the community to all of us who are walking by. I wanted to say one more thing just for the last couple minutes together before I stop, and that is that as I was thinking through like the title of this, I emailed Jacob and Jen and said, what about grief, loss, and gratitude? And the reason that sort of came to me is because I have been doing this thinking lately about the connection between grief and gratitude. And sometimes like my sort of discipline of gratitude that I've developed in my own life as a spiritual practice, sometimes it has gotten in the way of acknowledging grief, because I'll say, I have so much to be grateful for. I can't even acknowledge this loss when I'm so grateful that our finances are fine. I can't acknowledge this loss that I have around financial security, or I feel so grateful that our family is together right now, or that I don't even want to acknowledge sort of the loss of being able to see my mom every 2 days, or have her come into the house. But actually, it occurred to me as I was sort of trying to unwind that, that something about acknowledging grief actually seems to allow for a deeper gratitude. And The reason that I showed this picture is this is It's a Wonderful Life, Jimmy Stewart. And this is such an interesting movie to me, I think, because the end, of course, I'm assuming everyone's seen it. I don't know if that's the case, right? It's such part of, like, I think our culture norms, especially around Christmas time. But you know, what happens at the end is he ends up deeply, deeply grateful for his family and his community. And that's really the sort of end of it, is this renewed, deep appreciation and gratitude. But actually, he went through this grieving process of letting go of all of the things that he didn't get to do in his life. You know, the movie is a lot about how he wanted to travel the world. And this was this, like, really deep, you know, want. And he didn't end up traveling the world. He ended up taking over the business of his father and staying in the same community and getting married and not doing any of those dreams that he'd had as a teenager. And so in the way, the movie really shows that once, you know, he had sort of grieved the loss of those dreams and of all of the things he'd wanted to do, and was able to let them go. And it opened him up to the gratitude of what is his life, you know, that this is my life, and how grateful he was for it. And I started thinking about that it seemed like the more I acknowledged losses and grief, the more I became kind of aware of what I actually have to be grateful for. And once I sort of really acknowledged that I really was feeling the loss of my mom's party, you know, and this vision that I'd had for it, and all this planning that I had done and my hopes for it, it sort of opened up for me that my brother, who came from Abu Dhabi, he lives in the Middle East, he'd come for the party. He is now stuck here, you know, he can't go back to Abu Dhabi. They are not letting anybody back in. And so he's now been living at my mom's house. He was supposed to come for like a 5-day visit, and has now been living at my mom's house for 7 weeks. And I've been able to talk to him almost every day. And, you know, it sort of opened me up to, I haven't had this kind of relationship with my brother, this kind of time, or talking with my brother, or even texting him on a daily basis for maybe never, 35 years, you know. He's been out of the country for I don't know how long. And so it sort of opened that piece up to me. And so I do feel like there's a deep connection to acknowledging grief and loss, and being able to feel more grateful. And so I wanted to just end with that, with this sort of ask, you know, to consider, you know, what has possibly the grief that we're having, what doors has it possibly opened to us, recognizing what we're deeply grateful for, as well. And I'll end there, and would love to hear from people, from others, about your experiences or thoughts about any of this.
All right, a lot of you might be muted, so if you want to ask a question, just be sure to unmute your computer and ask a question.
Well, I wanted to share, I guess, a comment. I have deeply been feeling the loss of going to my sister's like every other weekend for like a mental break. And we also have a yearly sister gathering that we couldn't have. And listening to you talk, I realized that I felt that was insignificant to address it in myself. But after listening to you, yeah, I think I just named it. I really am feeling that loss. Thank you for giving me that permission to feel it. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for sharing that.
You know, Elizabeth, I had my niece was born a couple weeks ago, and we were so scared about all of the, you know, going to the hospital and her giving birth, and my sister had to give birth alone. Her husband wasn't even allowed in the room, and I feel silly for mourning the loss of being able to go to the hospital and hold my niece for the first time, and that it feels so trivial. People are dying all around me, and I feel sad that I can't celebrate a birth by holding, my niece in the hospital. I did get to see her, but my father got to see the new baby through a slider. We brought the baby into the backyard, and it's very painful to miss out on joyous occasions, and it feels it feels terrible. But I really appreciate the being able to name it. So maybe I need to go yell that in the backyard that I'm upset about it, and then be able to tame it.
Thank you for sharing that. Both of you were sharing the loss of connection and of joyous occasions. And they're really good examples of something that's a loss in the sense that we won't get it back. It really is lost. Your sister's husband won't be able to see the birth of this child. It's lost. So thank you for sharing that.
Elizabeth, it's been interesting, well, not interesting, actually really sad for me has been seeing how losses that normally I would just be able to manage, they seem so much greater right now. And I don't know if it's because of all the unnamed losses or just this kind of general sense of loss. But we have a real leader in our church community, a couple, and they are going to be gone for a little while. They want to be able to be with their family. Their family's on the East Coast, and so they're going to be gone for a certain number of months. And it was really surprising to me because I don't know them all that well, although I do a lot of different activities with them. How intense my grief was when I realized that they were going across the country. And I really tried to figure it out for a while, what was it that had caused this intense reaction? And I think in your speaking today, it really helped me to kind of understand that these things are very wrapped up, they're very interconnected. And so, being able to name that loss within the context of all these other losses and be able to understand that they're connected, it helps me to not feel overwhelmed. Because I think that that's the hardest thing about grief in this period is that you don't stop and go outside and go talk to friends or go for, the different sorts of things that you do that would normally break the grieving process. So it can really continue on. And so being able to identify it does help to begin to at least mitigate it a bit.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I think there's two things that you said that I think are so important. One of them is that loss is cumulative or can be cumulative, it can build. And that's why, for if when we have a loss in childhood that's really deep, and then, later we have a child that leaves for college, it can feel deeper than we think it should, or deeper than it might, we think matches the moment. But there does seem to be kind of a accumulation. And I think we're all feeling so many different losses and so many different collective losses that I think it does compound. And the other thing that you mentioned is the break. I think all of us have been through grief in some aspect before this. And usually what happens with grief is you touch it and then you back away because we get distracted, or our mind gives us a break, or our mind forgets. When I was a kid, the deepest grief I ever had was losing this dog that I loved so deeply. And it was the first experience I had where I remember the dog had died and be in this intense grief. And then the mind would forget for a few minutes or a few hours or a few days. And I would get a break. And then it would come back. And that's how grief is. It gives us breaks. It kind of, we touch it and come back. And I relate to what you're saying, that right now we don't have the same breaks
Yeah.
We don't have the same way to distract or connect with others in a way that erases
That's
that
right.
moment. You know, we're sort of sitting in it. And that's hard not to have a break.
Mm. Yes.
I think sadness for people who have had losses during this time has hit me. People who've lost their mothers just through natural causes. My sister-in-law, whose grandson is in ICU for the last few weeks, he's a newborn. And just knowing that she hasn't been able to hold this baby or touch this baby at all, and that those parents are completely alone in navigating this situation. And it's frustrating to know that you know, you can't gather and hug people.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, you can't gather and hug people. Mm-hmm.
I had anger, a lot of anger at first, because 3 days into the quarantine, my neighbor came over and decided he was going to sue me for having to dig up roots from my pine tree. And I was furious with him. I mean, I thought of really bad things to do to him. Luckily, I didn't. And as it came further along, and as you're saying, I think that, well, the same day my brother had heart surgery, which he should know, I mean, he's perfect weight and all that. And then my mother set fire to her kitchen, and one was in Florida and one was in New York. So I had boom, boom, boom. So God heard a lot that you don't want to hear right now, because I was not nice about it. But I was angry. And I realize now, I think I focused a lot of the anger on my neighbor. And I even said to him, how dare you do this to me with all the stuff that's going on in the world? You are awful. And I'm not dealing with this right now. And, you know, I just told my insurance company we can now deal with it, because I wasn't going to let anybody in my house or whatever, because I'm high risk for COVID. But it also made me think about all these protests that people are doing. You know, they're angry, but they're not thinking rationally, a lot of them, I think, to be protected. And so I think that there's an awful lot of anger in our country right now. And for me, I've had a lot of losses, so it's much easier to be angry than depressed. So I usually choose anger when something happens as a coping skill for me. I'm also retiring, and everybody keeps going, oh, that's so sad, we won't be able to give you a party. And it's like, I honestly feel like the rest of the world is more important than my retirement, you know, and I am so blessed. So I'm glad I'm retiring, actually, because it's a mess in the school systems right now. So, but all those feelings and the changes we have to make, and the rituals we have to change. And the good news was we had my mother's 90th birthday party last year, thank God. And we were all able to do it. So it was a good memory. Okay, I'm done, sorry.
Thank you for sharing. I really appreciate your honesty about anger.
Oh, yeah.
I think a lot of us relate to that. Anger is often easier to feel than the more vulnerable feelings underneath it.
Right.
Particularly fear, right? You
Yep.
said I think
Oh,
there's
yeah.
a lot of anger in our country right now, and there's a lot of fear, and
Mhm.
anger is not an uncommon sort of cap on top of fear or grief. So thank you for sharing.
An interesting, but probably fairly minor kind of grief that I think I'm experiencing a lot is the lack of anticipation. We have a grandson being born this month. We may be going to visit in July. That was the plan originally. We don't know if it's going to happen. And they live not too far from Yellowstone, so we were planning on going there. I'm a teacher, and I plan lots of rich and exciting lessons, performances, things like that. And all of those are basically put on hold. So all of it may, you know, the trip may happen. I know the school things won't, but in either case, I can't spend the time planning, and I really enjoy that. And so that's a part of what my normal life would be that I'm grieving right now.
Thank you for sharing that. I really related to what you were saying. I'm guessing a lot of people did, but I also, you know, especially for things like parties and celebrations and for work, sometimes I plan for long times around like in person, you know, sort of larger workshops or things like that. And so there's sort of this ebb and flow about planning, and then completing, and then there's sort of a break. And right now I feel like there's very little of this and more of this. And I've been thinking a lot about the loss of, you know, fear is very, very contagious. It's a very contagious emotion. But so's like elevation or effervescence, or, you know, that sort of elevation euphoria is very contagious too. And without sort of concerts and sporting events and celebrations, you know, these things that bring people all together where you feel that sort of collective, you know, elevation or euphoria. We don't have sort of those, you know, peaks and valleys anymore. And that is a loss. I know we're gonna end up wrapping up soon. I wanted to share this picture that I, right before we end, which is, this was taped on a local restaurant that we walked by. Yeah, I thought, my son
too
thought,
cute.
he said, look at that, it's one of those tariff things. And I
Oh
thought,
my God.
it's so interesting, this idea of connecting to people that we don't know, like that like the chalk art, you know, that we're doing something for somebody that we haven't met, that we don't know. We're putting these things out. And I just love that idea of someone wanting to do something for people who walked by. And it also seems like a good message, like for all of us to like take a breath and like take what we need, you know, what do I need right now? So I really like this. Thank you all for sharing your experiences
Thank you.
and thoughts this last
Thank you.
few minutes.
Thank you, Elizabeth.
Thank you.
Thank you so
Wonderful.
much for being with us.
you,
Elizabeth.
Elizabeth.
I really appreciated it a lot.
Very
Thank you.
helpful. Very helpful.
Thank you very much.
Good stuff.
Yeah, thank you for your words of gratitude to Elizabeth. We're very thankful for her time today. To let you know, a next step that our WISE committee is putting together, that in 2 weeks, we're going to have another session related to this topic that's going to be kind of breakout groups to allow you to have more time to digest and dialogue with other people and to have conversations. And so that'll be led by little group leaders who are professional therapists themselves, who are going to be helping us have these more individualized conversations.